So welcome all. We are so happy to see you and join in our conversation on defending democracy in the digital age. I'm Sherry George with the League of Women Voters of Alaska. We joined the League of Women Voters of Maine's Digital Democracy Working Group following the 2022 National Convention and been helping bring this series to you all. For the last 20 months, we've covered, among other things, data privacy, combating extremism, the discriminatory effects of AI and algorithm, and the elusiveness of regulation to defend elections and democracy, pre-bunking strategies to get ahead of online manipulation, and most recently, how the nexus of misinformation, AI-generated content, and automated phone contact was used to dissuade the people of New Hampshire from voting in their primary election. Today, we're so pleased to have Gowri Ramachandran from the Brennan Center for Justice to share with us her and her colleagues' research on the intimidation of state and local election officials and the Brennan Center's May 2024 survey of local election officials that covered election security and staff safety, threats, harassment, and abuse, the threat of political interference, the need for additional resources for elected officials, and the use of artificial intelligence if they use it in their work. Gowri serves as Deputy Director in the Brennan Center's Election and Government Program. Her work focuses on election security, election administration, and combating election disinformation, all things near and dear to our hearts. Before joining the Center, she was a professor of law at Southwestern Law School in Los Angeles, where she taught courses in constitutional law, employment discrimination, critical race theory, and the Ninth Circuit Appellate Litigation Clinic. Her work was published in the Election Law Journal, North Carolina Law Review, and Yale Law Journal Online, among others. She served on the Ninth Circuit's Fairness Committee, which considers racial, religious, gender, and other disparities in the administration of justice. Remember that throughout the presentation, please enter your questions into the chat. So now over to you, Gowri.
Hi, thank you all for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. I do have some slides that I'm going to use just because there's like a lot of numbers and bar charts and things like that in the information I'm presenting. And I know that if you just rattle off a bunch of numbers, people can zone out. So I thought I'll use those slides for that purpose. But I hope that we can treat this as a, like an informal conversation. I know this is a topic that's important to so many members in the league. So yeah, I hope we can be casual. People don't have to feel like super strictly limited to the topic when we're doing the questions. Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity. So I thought I'll first give you guys some of the research on state and local elected officials. So this is candidates and those who are in public office. And then I will present the information we got from our latest survey on election administrators, the May 2024 one that Shari was referencing. And it's a little out of order, even though I'm going to do it that way, because we started surveying local election officials and asking them about the threats and harassment that they were experiencing in 2021. And it's really because of that work that me and the others on my team got interested in looking at the problem of threats and harassment against just public officials more generally. There's been a lot of reporting on an increase in threats against members of Congress, but we saw that there just really hadn't been a lot of research into the experiences of state and local public officials. So, mayors, city council people, school board members, all of that stuff. So that work was really inspired by our work on election administrators and poll workers and threats against those folks. But I'm going to present that first, just because the annual survey we do of election officials is really the most recent thing on the topic. So I'll present that second. So I'm going to share my screen here. And let me just make sure I get the right app up here. Let's see. Here we go. Is that working for you all? All right. And let's see, let's do it in the slideshow version so that can be a little bit bigger there because sometimes the print gets small. All right. So we did this research in 2023. And what we did is we did a bunch of quarterly surveys of local public officials, elected officials, so things like city council people, mayors, that sort of thing. And we also did one survey in 2023 of currently serving state legislators. Part of the reason for that difference is that state legislators are really hard to get to answer surveys. So we knew that doing a quarterly survey of those folks was probably not going to yield a lot of responses. And it's also just a smaller group, right? There's way fewer state legislators in the country than there are people who hold all these different local offices. And we asked them about different forms of abuse that they may or may not have been receiving. And unfortunately, as you can see from some of these numbers, the answers we got are really pretty concerning. So among local office holders, overall, you can see those numbers of threats. It's about 1 in 5. It's more for women than for men. It's a really high number. If you look at state legislators, the numbers are really, really quite terrifying there. 43% of them experiencing threats. And one thing I highlight when I show people this research is that, sometimes people say, well, people are going to, be vigorous and angry sometimes about policy positions. Isn't that just kind of part of what comes with the job when you run for office? But we specifically asked about whether people were experiencing insults, harassment, threats, or attacks, and we gave them definitions of those terms in the survey. So we made very clear, not everything really qualifies as a threat, might be, insulting or might be harassment. And even with that menu of options, these numbers, in my opinion, are really just way too high and really disturbing when you look at how many people are saying they've experienced threats and harassment as well. An example of harassment that we gave was being stalked, on your way home. I don't think that's something people should consider to be just, part of the job of serving in public office. So we did confirm, just like the trend we've seen with Congress, that the numbers are really, really high for people in state and local office. And we really wanted to lift this up because, people in state and local office don't tend to have the kind of resources that, a Speaker of the House or somebody like that might have at the national level. So it's really difficult to deal with this problem. And then that quote there is, it's an example of a quote from one of the legislators we interviewed about, a very, very serious threat that she obtained. Oh, I forgot to mention, in addition to those surveys, we also did long form, hour-long interviews with about 36 state current and former state legislators to get some details on the experience. We found that women and people of color, and women of color especially, received not necessarily more abuse, depending on what population you were talking about, but the kind of comments that really, I think any of us can understand would really impact you a lot. So women were more likely to receive hostile comments about their appearance, about their age, and you can see that way more hostile comments about their family members or their gender. And so the kind of nature of it can be potentially more upsetting and more impactful depending on some of these identity groups. We also saw among local office holders, we were able to see some really big differences between office holders of color and white office holders, more likely to receive these hostile comments about religion, which I found interesting. I hadn't actually expected that, or more likely to receive hostile comments about one's family members, which, you know, I'm sure we can all sympathize with that being particularly impactful. And one thing I know, a lot of people ask, how come you're not seeing these kind of differences in when it comes to the state legislators as compared to the local office holders, especially on race and ethnicity? Part of it is just that there aren't that many state legislators that are non-white, so it's like harder to document these differences. And the other reason is that because we had just that one survey of the state legislators, we asked them about whether they'd experienced these problems either during their current term in office or for the campaign for their current term. So on average, that would be about 3 years of a time period that we're talking about and asking about. Whereas for the local office holders, because we were doing that quarterly survey, we just asked about what they had experienced in the last 3 months with each survey. So I kind of suspect that part of what's going on is that the baseline level of this abuse is really, really unacceptably high for everyone, and that our office holders of color are probably getting it more frequently. And so because of it being a more frequent issue, you see that pop up in the survey where they were asked about these little 3-month periods. And you can see there a really horrible example of this is from one of the state legislators we interviewed, comments that that they received. And actually, this instance, it doesn't show up here on the slide, but one thing people may not realize that 3/5 joke and that lynching joke this legislator described was actually made by a fellow member of the legislature on the floor of the legislature. So really, you can imagine how much that would impact someone. And then another thing that we documented that, you know, it's not surprising in a way, but it is important that people understand the real impact on democracy that all of this is having. All of this abuse really does impact office holders in terms of how they interact with their constituents and how they do some of the, you know, sort of basic components of being a representative. So for instance, you have really high rates of people saying they're deterred from doing events in public spaces, posting on social media. Those were huge numbers. A lot of folks just respond to this by saying, you know, I'm just out on social media. I'm not gonna participate. And this, we were really surprised that people said, because it's not the kind of thing you imagine a elected official typically admitting to, because there's a lot of pressure for them to, you know, show that they're tough and they're strong. But many people told us that they were deterred from working on controversial topics by all of this abuse, which is obviously a really negative impact for our democracy if people don't feel free to work on the policy issues that they may care about, even though it may provoke this kind of abuse. In terms of whether this is increasing, I know we had a question in advance about this, kind of the trends. Is it going up? Is it going down? At least according to the state legislators, most of them do think it's either going up or staying about the same. Not very large numbers said that they think it's decreasing. And women were more likely to say the seriousness of these incidents is increasing. And interestingly, we found Republicans were actually more likely than Democrats to say that the frequency of this kind of abuse is increasing recently. And in terms of the, you know, the reason for that, at least anecdotally in our interviews, some of the Republican legislators we spoke with mentioned that they are actually getting abuse from members of their own party. So the legislator might be kind of a moderate or a centrist, or maybe really went into public office because they care about cutting red tape for businesses, right? They're just not like a culture warrior kind of person. And because some of these folks don't want to take really extreme positions on those sort of culture war issues like reproductive rights and LGBT rights, just the refusal to take a really extreme position was incurring backlash from within one's own party. So that may be part of why actually more Republicans were citing an increase in these incidents. In terms of the costs, not only all those costs to democracy that we saw on the previous slides about, being less willing to talk to constituents, bring family to events, that sort of thing. There are some differences in terms of the income of office holders and what kinds of precautions they're able to take. So in a way, not surprising, but it just does confirm that this does have disparate impacts on people depending on their wealth coming into office. The more wealthy group was much more likely to do something like buy some identity theft online security services, or even move where they live temporarily for protection. There were some age differences we found as well. Younger legislators were more likely to report that they were deterred from these activities. And I think because of the way the questions were asked, you had everyone ages 18 to 49, kind of really lumped into one group there. And I suspect there may be some impact going on there based on who has, school-age children, or more likely to have school-age children and sort of being more impacted by this. There were some items where women of color we were able to document, even though it's a smaller group. We're sort of experiencing really heavy impacts. In particular, women of color were really likely to report that they kind of changed their travel routes or avoid traveling alone, or had even, despite typically having lower incomes than other office holders, moving homes or moving offices for safety. And this one is, again, I think not surprising, but really just upsetting, that women in general and women of color in particular were way more likely to report that they were experiencing some of this hostility that was sexual in nature. So it's kind of a downer of a research project, I know that, but we do have some policy recommendations because it's the Brennan Center and we always do that. And one of our policy recommendations I really want to highlight because it's not even quite a policy recommendation, it's really just a recommendation for the community. And this is something that came from many of the people we interviewed. They said one of the things that helped the most in terms of being able to withstand this kind of behavior and go ahead and run for office and stay in office anyway, is when other public leaders would speak out against it. And in particular, if someone from a different political party spoke up in defense of their colleagues and spoke out against this kind of behavior, that was really helpful, people said. So that's something that, of course, doesn't apply only to public officials. It applies to community leaders, business leaders, right, faith leaders, anyone sort of speaking up against this abuse, because it really is still an extremist and minority of people who engage in this kind of behavior, right? And so pointing out that the vast majority of voters and citizens who want to engage with their representatives don't agree with this kind of behavior. And believe in treating everyone respectfully. We also recommend mental health services for office holders. It really varies by jurisdiction whether sort of adequate health insurance is provided to office holders, and certainly candidates often are lacking in that kind of coverage while they're running for office. We also recommend that states should actually monitor abuse of office holders. You have like the U.S. Capitol Police does this for members of Congress. It really varies when we interviewed people, really varies by state and by local jurisdiction, whether there is anyone really tasked with collecting reports of this kind of behavior, and determining, whether there's a population that might need more in terms of security resources, or a really significant threat that might require some, extra drive by someone home, things like that. We also didn't expect this going into the research, but we just heard over and over in our interviews that the proliferation of guns is something that exacerbates this, and that makes something that someone otherwise might just brush off and try to ignore really concerning to them. That feeling that, like, anyone in a crowd might be armed. And so that's why one of our recommendations is actually that states should regulate the open and concealed carry of guns in places where office holders are interacting with the public. You'd be surprised, not every state capital forbids bringing weapons into the Capitol building. And there's many counties in some of the more conservative states where at the state level, the government has required that people be allowed to be armed in public buildings, even if the county or the city, would prefer to regulate that. We also have some recommendations on campaign finance to allow people to spend campaign funds on security things like giving ride shares to their staff and that sort of thing. We also have some kind of vague recommendations for social media companies, because there's a bunch of Supreme Court cases that are in the works, probably coming out this week, on the way government and social media interact. But our hope is that, when people respond to those cases and react to them, they do so in a way that really prioritizes the ability of everybody to engage in public discourse, including online. So that is kind of it on our on the research on public officials more generally. And then I'm going to check how I'm doing on time. I'll try to go through the research on election officials and election workers, which I know many of you are super interested in, quite quickly. Let me check the chat here though and see if we should, if there's any questions here that we might want to address before moving on to the other survey. Let's see. In terms of the question about whether we controlled for political party, yeah. So all that data I just presented to you, we weighted it based on sort of the region that people were from and all of that, to have like a nationally representative survey. And we did actually get we're very proud of this, especially in the state legislator survey, because we're not aware of anyone else doing this successfully. We did get quite a few Democratic and Republican responses, so we were able to control for that and wait for that. And so those reported numbers were all sort of nationally representative of political parties. So we did get slightly more responses from Democrat affiliated politicians than Republican, but we were able to wait for it to make it nationally representative. And then in terms of how many people were surveyed, for the state legislators, we got about, our full report has the numbers, it was about 350 or so in that range, state legislators answered the survey, which is a pretty good number for that population. They really don't like answering surveys. And then for the local officials, because we did those quarterly surveys, we were able to get a lot more. We had about 1,100 or 1,200 total responses of different people from across those times. For the state legislators, we sent the survey to everybody to just try to get enough responses. For the locals, we sent to sort of random samples of local officials across the country. And then in terms of were there states that had more abuse than others, in this survey, we didn't, for the elected officials, and I'll try to answer that question about the election officials when we talk about the next survey. we didn't really find big differences sort of regionally or in states, which was a little surprising, actually. I thought we might see something. We did not see very, very big differences. Um, and then in terms of yes, I definitely agree. The income and wealth are different factors. The question we asked about that we were able to look for disparities on was income, not necessarily wealth. Oh, and thank you that someone put in that information about the exact numbers there. Yeah, so that's it's kind of a sobering report, but it's definitely something. I know we got a question in advance of this about, is this something that's here to stay? Is it going to go away? That sort of thing. I hope that this is not something that's here to stay, and I hope that it's not something that we just normalize and get used to, and that is really part of why we wanted to publish this report, to sort of call attention to the problem before before people just think it's something we have to accept as part of our civic life. Okay, so let me, I'm going to share a different screen here, and it's on our election official survey, just because it's a lot of numbers and I know it can be nice to look at the visuals. So one moment while I pull that up. Sorry, it's in a different program, so take me a second to get in there. Okay. All right, how's that? Everyone can see this one? Okay, great. So I'll try to be pretty fast so we can leave plenty of time for conversation here. Um, but for this survey, this is one that we do every year at the Brennan Center, and I know some of you have probably seen prior iterations of it, or maybe even checked it out on the website in advance. We do this every year. We send it to all of the local election officials in the country, and so it's quite a few there. You see the number. We send it to about 11,000, and the reason for that is that some states administer elections by municipality. And so you have quite a lot of local election officials in those states like Wisconsin, and Michigan are the big states that do administer by municipality. For this year, we had about 928 local election officials responded to the survey. And we did, just like with the other surveys, we weighted on region and jurisdiction size and that kind of thing, just to make sure it wasn't just like all people from Wisconsin or that sort of thing, answering the survey. And the kind of big takeaways from it, and that we really want to emphasize because we know that this information can be kind of sobering, is that most local election officials have actually taken some steps since 2020 to deal with these problems, right? They've taken some kind of proactive steps to try to improve safety and security for their staff, for voters, for folks that are showing up to volunteer as well. So in fact, 92% have said they've done something to improve security for voters, election workers, or election infrastructure. And many of them have done all three. About And then the other sort of big takeaway from this, unfortunately, is that there was a little bit of a drop in the amount of threats and abuse that election officials were reporting in 2023. So it's high in every year, but it ticked down just a tiny bit in 2023. Unfortunately, it went back up to the 2022 levels when we did the survey this year, which is that about 38% reported experiencing some kind of threat, harassment, or abuse. And there's really high levels of concern, as you would expect, about the safety of their colleagues and their staff, and their family and loved ones. Really high numbers are also very worried this year about political interference in how they do their jobs. Maybe people from candidates or parties pressuring them to do their job in a partisan manner instead of in the nonpartisan manner that we know the overwhelming number of election officials do. And then we also asked about budget and that sort of thing. And we found that very high numbers say they do need an increased budget to like meet all of these security needs. And they're very concerned. 43% are concerned about recruiting enough poll workers for November. And we did ask, just because we know it's something that people are very, very curious about, whether folks are using artificial intelligence in any way in election administration. And the result we got is that very, very few election officials are using AI for anything. A few are for translating materials into different languages we saw, but it's a very small number. But a much larger number, about 33%, say it would be nice to get some guidance, maybe from some federal agencies or that sort of thing about using AI safely. So here, this is digging into a little more detail into the types of steps that election officials have taken to increase security. And a few of these involve sort of coordination with law enforcement. And so I wanted to emphasize that. I know those of us who worry about voter protection and election protection a lot, sometimes we hear about law enforcement and polling places, and we don't like hearing those words come together because we're worried that law enforcement presence might actually deter voters or concern voters. A lot of what is being discussed here is really just making sure that there is communication between local election officials and law enforcement ahead of the election, so that, if people are calling 911 or reporting disturbances or that kind of thing, law enforcement has actually thought about that beforehand. They know that they should call the election official, that they should really defer to election officials in terms of like when there really is a need for law enforcement and when there's not. And one thing I do have to mention to folks on this is that we have in our work with election officials found that there are people who might consider themselves like election integrity activists or that sort of thing, who have done things in recent election cycles, like calling the police because they think someone is committing voter fraud or that sort of thing. And so it is important in an environment where, you might get phone calls from overzealous election monitors. It is helpful for there to be some coordination and discussion between law enforcement and election officials beforehand, so that they can have a planned response for that. We saw that people were very appreciative in those states where there has been some additional funding or any legislation to protect election workers. And here's an example. A lot of folks said that they've sort of shared just information about like when are voting hours, things like that with law enforcement, where are the polling places, so that they sort of have a plan if there is any kind of incident ahead of time. And these are some of our kind of sobering numbers on the threats, harassment, and abuse. And you can see there the uptick from 2023. And definitely this is something we get every year in our survey. Local election officials overwhelmingly say that this is not an old problem. This is new. The level of these threats have definitely increased since 2020. This is something that makes election officials a little bit different from other public officials. Most research on public officials more generally finds that a lot of these threats are, like online over social media or a phone call. But there's pretty high numbers of election officials who report that they have been threatened in person. So that's another reason that it is really important for there to be better cooperation and connections between election officials and local law enforcement, who would be the primary type of law enforcement to respond to something in person. And here we have some detail on the, the types of concerns that, of course, election officials have for their colleagues and their staff. Here, this is something that, is getting into the news a little bit more. There was this kind of rash of swatting incidents earlier in the year. And so swatting is when someone, might call 911 or that sort of thing, and they make up a very alarming sort of incident report, but it's actually fake. And the idea is that that will cause, armed law enforcement to rush over to the victim of the swatting. There's been an uptick in that against public officials. And there is election officials are reporting that they're quite concerned. About 23% are very or somewhat concerned about these swatting incidents. And in terms of anecdotally talking to election officials, there are concerns that someone might engage in this kind of behavior targeting a polling place, or that sort of thing, or a tabulation center, and really cause some havoc, which is another reason why we think the coordination with law enforcement ahead of time, so that they know how to confirm whether these things are real or not, and how to do that quickly is helpful. There are people leaving their jobs, as was mentioned at the beginning of all of this, because of these safety concerns, which is definitely something we all are concerned with. And because of that, because of the turnover, and folks leaving the profession due to these concerns, and just also some regular turnover that happens from year to year, about 1 in 4 local election officials we're estimating are going to be doing their first presidential election this fall. And so I know you all know, as people who volunteer and help out, that just that can just lead to a higher likelihood of innocent mistakes, right? When someone's doing this kind of thing, high pressure work for the first time. And here we have the concerns about political interference. We also asked about these information requests. I don't know if you all are seeing that in your home jurisdictions, but there has been in the last couple of election cycles a real uptick in these kind of like boilerplate Freedom of Information Act requests that election officials are getting for all kinds of data. And it's just a lot for them to actually process and deal with while they're also trying to run elections. And some of these requests are just very, very overbroad and not really carefully drawn to get helpful information. Definitely many believe in needing an increased budget for dealing with all these challenges. And unfortunately, one of the most common requests for increased budget that people report having been denied was requests to increase wages or increase the number of personnel of their staff. And then these are the things on the AI that I mentioned before. Pretty uncommon right now for folks to be using that. Okay, so let me stop there. I've gone a little bit over our planned time because I really want to make sure we have time for questions. Oh, I just saw someone asking, has anyone else lost sound? Are most people able to hear? Okay. All right, good. All right, so I can look at these questions in the chat, and then also people, please feel free to add there. Let's see. I do see Jennifer mentioning the kind of tolerance coming from the top down. I have to agree with that. I think one of the reasons the people we interviewed said so commonly that, getting support from other leaders is so important is that there's a flip side to that, right? When you have public leaders kind of not being a good role model in terms of how to engage in civics and civic life. I think that that is probably part of why so many people are reporting increases in this behavior. And I see Michael's asking, since the number of local election officials responding to the survey has increased, I don't know if it's because of a growing concern about safety, or it could be because, I mean, to be honest, we have used this survey now to help advocate for protections for election workers and that sort of thing at the state level. So I do think more election officials are becoming aware that, advocacy groups like us and like the league and others we're more able to make those requests for budget increases and protections and that sort of thing if we have like good response rates to this survey. So I think that might be part of why, like, people are they're hearing about the survey in the news, and then they get the survey in the email and they say, hey, I remember reading this last year and I know how helpful it was, like, let me respond. But certainly it could be an indication of growing concern about safety. The percent of local election officials reporting the threats hasn't changed a huge amount. I did mention that it has gone up since 2023, but it was higher back in 2022. Like, it kind of like went back up to the 2022 level this year. So I'm not sure it's like a just, steadily increasing, or more like it may be that in election years, there's more attention on election officials. And so it kind of goes up and down maybe with the even and odd numbered years. That's my guess of what pattern we're probably going to see as we continue to do the survey annually. In terms of the sort of intersection between, online things and the kind of threats, I did mention there were pretty high numbers of those who said they were threatened, said they had gotten in-person threats. That was 61%, but a lot said they had gotten online threats as well, right? Like, many people said they'd gotten all kinds of threats, right? Like, they said, yes, I've been threatened, and then these are the different types of threats I've received. So I do think certainly this kind of behavior does exist online and is a problem. And I do think a lot of people anecdotally report that just the kind of tone online, can be kind of nasty, and people can kind of, it can kind of amplify this and maybe increase some of this behavior. And unfortunately, kind of normalize it. If when people see someone else doing this online, they may think it's more acceptable. So I do think there is a problem. And certainly when we ask election officials, I think in a prior year we asked about social media, well over 50% said they did think that social media and disinformation about elections on social media was a kind of a driving factor in threats and harassment. The election officials themselves definitely blame that as part of the problem. So we've got a question here about how can levels of concern be monitored during 2024? Like, what kind of role can we all play in monitoring these threats? So I'm sure many people on this call participate in the Election Protection Coalition. I think that's one important thing to do. But I do think that one really helpful thing to do is definitely I think it's important for all of us in this kind of like nonpartisan community to really make sure we sort of coordinate through our local election officials if there are these kinds of problems, because we're really trying to send the message to law enforcement that they should be following the election officials' lead, in terms of how to respond to these problems. And what's really appropriate for that official's community and their voter population that they serve. And I think the more that we can support that approach as well by also trying to filter things through the election office, then I think the better. Okay, are there other questions that folks had that they weren't able to put in the chat?
Gowri, this is Sherry, and one question that we had several of us had discussed, because it's been in the news recently, was this business of, and it's sort of tangential to your survey and analysis, but it was a real we see it as a real threat, or some of us see it as a real threat, to having an electorate getting truthful information to use when they're voting. So the mis and disinformation piece. So
Right.
Whether you have thoughts or Brennan Center, you folks have talked together as a center, the reaction to the dissolution of Stanford's Internet Observatory and any other, we've also read about other academic research and leadership in misinformation, such as at Harvard and so on, that has been squelched to some extent.
Yeah.
So, and you all are part of a university community too. So, and you've worked in a university community.
Mhm.
So, do you have thoughts on that at all,
Yeah,
or do you feel like you can talk about it?
yeah, for sure. It's really terrible and heartbreaking actually how some of these efforts have shut down really at the same time, unfortunately, as the social media companies themselves, some of the big ones have also kind of pulled back on their efforts to fight election disinformation. Twitter had a whole policy about truthful information during the 2020 election. Whether they were great at enforcing that is maybe another question, but at least, the the attempt was there. The policy was there. Now that's Twitter's a big social media company and they're pulling back on that. Um, and at the same time as these universities have kind of become targeted, and the researchers have been targeted by people who are, frankly not happy about misinformation being exposed and corrected. Um, there's also this case, I know many of you may be familiar with it, Missouri versus Murphy. This is a lawsuit that some state attorney generals brought against the Biden administration. And most of the lawsuit is actually about efforts that the administration took to communicate with social media companies about vaccine disinformation and COVID disinformation during the pandemic. But some of the defendants in the lawsuit that were named were actually CISA, which is a cybersecurity and information security agency that actually does a lot to kind of help and support local election officials in their election security efforts. A piece of the lawsuit actually claimed that by helping election officials sort of communicate and tell social media companies about false information that they're seeing online that they think should be corrected, that is a problem as well. And this whole lawsuit basically claims that the government communication with the social media companies is a First Amendment violation. So kind of portrays the government as having bullied the social media companies. Um, it's all laughable to those of us who know that, like, who send reports of disinformation to social media companies because most of the time they don't do anything with it. So the idea that they're being bullied and over responding is sort of laughable. That case is still pending. The Supreme Court hasn't issued its decision. But we're hopeful at the Brennan Center that they're actually going to decide against the plaintiffs and in favor of the government defendants. Just based on the way the questioning went at oral argument, it does seem likely that they're going to rule in favor of the defendants. And we're hoping, and one thing that we're planning to do is really, if that's true, if it comes out well, that case, really amplify that and tell people like, okay, you don't need to be worried anymore. The Supreme Court has clarified that it's okay for the government to communicate about uh, truth and facts, and correct the record and communicate with social media companies about that. So it's time now to really double down on those efforts, right? And double down on ensuring that factual information is being amplified and being shared and encouraging the social media companies to do that. So I do hope that maybe that news item, when that Supreme Court case comes out, will be an opportunity to try to encourage people to re-up those efforts that you're right, it's tragedy that so many people have pulled back on that. We also do have an effort at the Brennan Center where we are talking to some of the researchers who are still researching election disinformation specifically, and gathering, what kinds of common rumors and misinformation they are seeing. And then we do like some message testing with a message testing firm to see what kinds of counter messages with truthful information are most effective with voters and most compelling. And then we try to share that information about what kinds of counter messages are effective. And right now we're doing that on a monthly basis. I can try to pull up before we end the meeting the link to that page where we do like a monthly update. Like here's the rumors that researchers are seeing, and here's like some of the most effective messages to correct that and counter that um, that that message testing firm finds. Um, but yeah, I definitely agree. The counter to a lot of this is truthful information. I do think when it comes to election workers and election officials specifically, a lot of this abuse is really tied to the fact that people are being told incorrect information about the jobs that the election officials are doing. And people are mistaken and, think that something nefarious is happening when that's actually very rare.
It does seem, at least speaking for the Alaska scene, because elections were so trusted and ran so well for so many years, that I would say, I would guess the vast majority of Alaskans don't even really understand what goes on in the election process. It's never been until the last, what, 4 or 5 years, it was almost never a question. And so people are basically, it's not the information isn't out there, but they haven't felt like they needed to know it because it always ran well. And now they don't really know how it works. And so now we're on this catch up. Well, this is how it really works. And then when they see that, they're really amazed at how difficult it would be to actually corrupt an election, at state by state basis. So there is an educational piece if people aren't so polarized that they're willing to listen to it and take it in and really think about it honestly. But to get back to one of your comments, and there was also in the chat about public officials, civic leaders, and so on, taking the lead in engaging and supporting public officials and the volunteers in promoting respectful interaction. If you have any feeling in some of your surveys or even anecdotal information about what you think that level of person, are they willing to be engaged in that? Is that something they don't? It seems obvious, doesn't it? But yet we don't see it very often that a civic leader or say a higher official in the state government, even local government, actually comes out and says the elections are secure and the people who work here, their main job is protecting your democracy, basically. Do you have some feeling about how willing people at that level are to engaging in this strategy?
Yeah, I do think we have had some successes in getting some, public leaders to make those statements. Actually, there's this group, it's called the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections, and we have support it, but it is a separate group from the Brennan Center, and it's a committee of a group of both law enforcement and election officials, sort of coming together to promote some of this. And they've had some success in getting like some local sheriffs and folks like that to make these public statements that are meant to be sort of calming and say, basically, elections are about democracy and, the security of the people that are trying to make it function is paramount. So I think there has been some, success on that front. I agree with you. It'd be great if we could get, candidates and that sort of thing, to be making those statements as well. And, even business leaders, those folks, sometimes
Right.
who the messenger is can make all the difference. But yeah, I do think that's one thing that we can try to encourage, in terms of, what role can we all have in trying to improve this situation. I do think, encouraging those positive statements, from people who are willing to make them. I do think it could be a really positive thing. Absolutely.
Yeah, I am concerned about. I mean, you read in online news, regular news outlets as well as social media. You have these influencers, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
the Taylor Swifts, the Dolly Partons, so on, who reach large numbers of people, and yet even those folks get a real heavy pushback. And maybe it's hard for me to understand why there should be pushback with someone who's saying we think everybody should be able to vote and you should treat your election workers as the sort of the heroes of democracy that they actually are. It seems hard to
I love that
understand.
idea of like getting Taylor Swift to say something nice about election workers. Um, I just
Yeah,
love it. Yeah. Because it's true. Some people have really have huge influence. Um, oh, and I see one question. I know we only have a few minutes left, but I do think this question is so important. Thank you, Minda. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Um, are there recommendations of how to reach the people actually making the threats? That election rumor page that I linked for you all in the chat, there's like a little dashboard of the message testing that's linked each month, and it actually divides out sort of by region and like some more detailed things, and kind of I believe people indicate their sort of partisan leanings in it when they participate in the message testing. Um, and I think, yeah, that, you know, it might be interesting to look at what kinds of messages work best with people who may be quite extreme in their initial leanings, because I would guess that that's probably correlated with those who feel driven to do something like make those threats. Um, but I do think there is ultimately a real challenge there that Minda is identifying, which is people being in these silos in terms of where they're getting their information from and where they're getting their news from. Sometimes it can be really hard to reach people in those silos. And so that is why these other messengers can be so important. Election officials are doing their best to educate voters with the truthful information, but usually your local clerk doesn't have the kind of following that some other influential people in their community might have. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I guess we are sort of closing in on the hour, so I'd like to thank all of you who are online for joining us, and Gowri, of course, for
Thank
giving us
you.
so much to think about. What our public servants are facing, how this translates to election offices, but also for your ideas on how maybe we can support them personally and their mission, or get others to do so that may have greater influence than each of us individually. So just to remind you all that there will be a recording of today's conversation will be posted to League of Women Voters of Maine's website soon. It's usually a few days. And the recordings of our earlier speakers are also posted there. So we encourage you to share this research with others that you know. And so now our little pitch for, if you'd like to help keep the series going, you could consider a small donation to our tip jar, which is on the League of Women Voters Maine's website. You can note digital democracy in the how should this donation be used box, which you have to look for, but it is there. And just to let you all know, we'll be taking a break from the series for July and August. We'd like you to stay tuned for our next gathering, which is planned for September. So watch for details. Let others know. Thank you again for joining our guests, Gowri, and the League of Maine and Alaska Today. So bye for now, and we'll see you in September.
Thank you.